In the year 1324, something happened in Cairo that the city's merchants would still be whispering about a decade later. Not with wonder, but with the hollow, desperate tone of men who had watched their savings dissolve. A man had passed through. Just passed through, on his way somewhere else. And in the weeks he spent there, moving through the markets like a slow tide, he had handed out so much gold, casually, almost carelessly, the way you might toss coins to a street performer, that the entire regional economy collapsed. The price of gold crashed. Merchants went bankrupt. Families who had been comfortable for generations found themselves scrambling. One man's generosity had functioned with surgical precision, like a financial weapon of mass destruction. That man had a name, and there is an almost certain chance that no one ever taught it to you. Picture the largest empire on Earth. Not Rome at its peak, not the Mongol hordes thundering across the steppe. The largest empire on Earth in the early 1300s, a kingdom so vast it contained more than half the world's known gold supply, cities that housed universities when most of Europe's population couldn't read, trade routes that stretched from the edge of the Sahara to the shores of North Africa like arteries in a living body. Now picture the man who sat at the center of all of it. Draped in gold, surrounded by 12,000 servants. The absolute ruler of a civilization so advanced, so wealthy, so cosmopolitan, that when word of it finally reached the courts of Europe, they simply didn't believe it. It had to be myth. It had to be exaggeration. Because if it wasn't, if it was real, then everything they thought they knew about the world needed to be rewritten. His name was Mansa Musa, King of Kings, Lord of the Mali Empire. And by every serious measure historians have been able to apply, adjusted for inflation, for the proportion of global wealth he controlled, for the sheer incomprehensible scale of his resources, the richest individual human being who has ever lived on this planet. We're not talking about a margin. We're talking about a gap so obscene that the fortunes of every tech billionaire, every oil dynasty, every medieval monarch you've ever heard of, stacked together, wouldn't come close to what this man commanded before breakfast. He didn't accumulate wealth the way empires usually do, grinding it out through conquest and tribute. He sat on top of a mountain of gold, so deep it had barely been touched, and he understood, with a clarity that was almost frightening, exactly what that meant. The Sahara in the 14th century was not a barrier. It was a highway. And Musa's empire didn't just sit beside that highway, it owned it. Every caravan of salt moving north, every bundle of gold moving south, every merchant who wanted to survive the crossing passed through Mali, paid their toll, bowed to the empire's authority, and moved on. Timbuktu wasn't a distant outpost at the edge of civilization. It was the intersection of three of the most important trade routes in the medieval world, a city of scholars and merchants and architects, where manuscripts were being copied and sold by the thousands, while the rest of the world was still arguing about whether the earth was round. This was the kingdom Musa ruled. This was the machine he inherited, expanded, and then announced to the world in the most spectacular way any ruler in recorded history has ever managed. And then, somehow, it was forgotten. Not faded, forgotten. Smoothed over with the practiced efficiency of people who had very good reasons to make sure the story didn't survive. The universities were ransacked. The manuscripts were scattered. The maps that showed Mali at the center of the known world were replaced with maps that showed nothing but blank space below the Mediterranean. Generations of children sat in classrooms and learned about the wealth of ancient Greece, the power of the Roman Empire, the genius of the European Renaissance, and heard not a single word about the man who was richer than all of it combined. That erasure wasn't an accident. It was a choice. And understanding why that choice was made tells you something about power that is far more dangerous than any history lesson you are ever supposed to receive. The merchants of Cairo didn't understand what was happening at first. One day, the markets were exactly as they always had been. Gold trading at its accustomed price. The economy running along the tracks it had followed for 100 years. Predictable and stable the way powerful cities tend to be when they've outlasted everyone who ever threatened them. Then a caravan arrived from the south. Not a caravan in the usual sense. Not a few dozen men on camels with bundles of trade goods. A column of 60,000 people stretched across the desert road like a slow river. 200 camels carrying sacks of gold dust, servants and soldiers and scholars and musicians, all moving north toward the holy city of Mecca. And at the center of it all, a man whose idea of traveling modestly was apparently incomprehensible to everyone who had ever encountered him. Within weeks, the gold markets of Cairo had buckled. Within months, the economic architecture of the region was cracked in ways that would take more than a decade to repair. And the man responsible had already left. He was on his way to Mecca. He hadn't even been trying to cause damage. Here is the thing that should stop you cold. That man, the one who accidentally detonated a financial catastrophe across the Mediterranean economy while performing a religious obligation, controlled more personal wealth than any human being whose life we have been able to document in recorded history. And we are not talking about close comparisons. Adjusted for the proportion of global wealth he personally commanded, the combined net worth of every billionaire alive today wouldn't reach his ankles. He ruled an empire that produced more than half the world's known gold supply, at a time when gold was literally the foundation on which every economy on Earth was built. He governed cities that housed universities, libraries, and manuscript markets when most of Europe's population couldn't read. He commanded armies, controlled trade routes, and operated a system of taxation and administration so sophisticated that the scholars who studied it 2 centuries later described it with barely concealed admiration. And there is a nearly certain chance that no teacher, no textbook, no history class in your entire education ever spent more than a passing sentence on his name. That is not an oversight. And before this story is done, you are going to understand exactly why. But first, stay in Cairo for a moment. Because what happened there in 1324 is one of the most consequential economic events of the medieval world, and it has been so thoroughly buried that most people have genuinely never heard of it. Mansa Musa, that was his name and his title simultaneously. Mansa, meaning King of Kings, arrived in Cairo with a retinue so large it consumed the city's resources the way a brush fire consumes dry grass, methodically, completely, without malice. He gave gold to the poor he encountered in the streets. He gave gold to mosques, to officials who received him, to merchants who sold him goods, to craftsmen who impressed him. He paid for everything in gold, donated in gold, tipped in gold, lavished gold on anyone who caught his attention with a carelessness that suggested he genuinely could not conceive of a world where gold was something you had to be careful with. The result was hyperinflation so severe that Egyptian historians who documented it were still writing about the damage a full decade after he had passed through. To understand why that matters, you need to feel what gold meant in the 14th century. Gold wasn't simply money in the way we think of money now, a number on a screen, an abstraction backed by government promises. Gold was the physical substance of stability itself. It was the foundation on which every transaction, every debt, every price in the known world rested. When the supply of gold in a market suddenly and catastrophically increased, when someone flooded the system with more gold than the system had ever been designed to absorb, the value of everything denominated in gold crashed through the floor. Merchants who held stockpiles of gold found their savings worth a fraction of what they had been worth the previous month. Prices collapsed, then destabilized in ways that made basic planning impossible. The entire economic architecture of the region cracked, not from war, not from plague, not from political collapse, but because a single man passed through on his way to prayer and couldn't stop being generous. And here is where the story turns genuinely strange. When Musa understood what he had done, when his advisors explained that his open-handed generosity had effectively detonated a slow-motion financial bomb across the Mediterranean economy, he tried to correct it. He began borrowing gold back from Cairo's merchants at high interest rates, deliberately pulling gold out of circulation in an effort to stabilize the prices he had wrecked. The richest man in the history of the world, taking out loans to repair damage caused by having too much. The structural absurdity of that image is almost impossible to sit with, but it tells you something critical about Mansa Musa that no textbook ever thought worth including. He was not a passive ruler sitting on inherited treasure. He understood what gold did when it moved. He understood systems, and that understanding was going to reshape the medieval world in ways that went far beyond one catastrophic week in Cairo. So why don't you know this story? Take that question seriously and let it sit. If a European king in 1324 had accidentally collapsed the economy of an entire region simply by passing through on a religious pilgrimage, we would know everything about him. We would know his childhood, his fears, the political calculations behind every major decision, the names of his horses. There would be films, television series, and university departments dedicated to his memory. But Mansa Musa, a ruler whose empire was larger than any contemporary European kingdom, whose capital housed tens of thousands of students and scholars, whose name appeared on European maps for generations as a mythological figure seated on a literal throne of gold because the cartographers couldn't quite process that he was real, barely rates a footnote in the curricula of most Western schools. That asymmetry is not a coincidence of history. It is a decision. And understanding who made that decision and why is the most important thread running through this entire story. But before we pull that thread, we need to understand the machine. Because Musa didn't simply inherit a kingdom, he inherited a system, a network of gold mines, salt routes, military alliances, and trade controls that had been engineered over generations by rulers who understood that lasting power doesn't come from conquest alone. It comes from controlling the flow. Whoever decides what moves and where it moves and what it costs to move it controls everything that comes after. Mali, under Musa, wasn't the richest empire in the world because it stumbled onto a lucky deposit of gold in the ground. It was the richest empire in the world because someone had spent a century building the architecture that made that gold impossible to access without going through Mali first. And Musa was about to use that architecture to do something no ruler had ever attempted on that scale. Here is the detail I keep coming back to. Everything that happened in Cairo, the economic collapse, the 12 years of recovery, the bewildered historians still documenting the damage a generation later, all of that was a side effect, a footnote on a footnote. Musa wasn't staging a demonstration of power for the benefit of the Mediterranean world. He wasn't sending a geopolitical signal to the courts of Europe or the sultans of Egypt. He was fulfilling a religious duty, and he brought 60,000 people and enough gold to destabilize a regional economy because that is simply what it looked like when Mansa Musa traveled without making a fuss. The most consequential economic event in the medieval Islamic world was an accident, a byproduct of faith. And if that single fact doesn't recalibrate everything you thought you knew about what was happening in West Africa in the 14th century, while Europe was still bleeding through the aftermath of the Black Death and most of the world had no idea this empire even existed, then you haven't fully felt it yet. But you will. Before there was Musa, there was a machine. And before you can understand the man, you have to understand what he inherited. Because the Empire of Mali wasn't a kingdom that grew naturally the way most kingdoms do, by conquest and luck and the slow accumulation of territory over centuries. It was engineered, deliberately, methodically, by a sequence of rulers who understood something that most of the ancient world never figured out. That the real source of power is not the resource itself, but the choke point through which the resource must pass. And Mali sat on the most important choke point in the medieval world, with the settled confidence of something that had always been there and intended to remain. To feel what that means, you have to understand the geography of West Africa in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Sahara Desert was not an obstacle. That is the first thing the textbooks get wrong when they bother to mention this part of the world at all. The Sahara was a highway, the primary commercial artery connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and through them to the rest of the known world. Caravans moved across it constantly, carrying two commodities that the medieval world needed the way modern economies need oil and semiconductors: gold from the south and salt from the massive deposits in the middle of the desert itself. Without salt, food couldn't be preserved, which meant people starved. Without gold, economies couldn't function, which meant empires collapsed. And the routes that carried both of those things ran directly through Mali's territory like veins through a living body. The empire that Musa would eventually rule didn't begin with him. It began, in its earliest recognizable form, with a man named Sundiata Keita, a figure so mythologized in West African oral tradition that separating the historical man from the legend is like trying to separate the river from the water. What we know is that in the mid-13th century, Sundiata broke the back of the Soso Empire, which had been grinding the Mande people under its heel for decades, and in doing so, created the political and military foundation on which everything that came after was built. He is the reason Mali existed as a unified, coherent power rather than a collection of competing chiefdoms. He is the trunk of the tree that Musa would grow into something extraordinary. And he understood from the beginning that the gold trade was not simply a source of revenue, it was a lever that could move the world. Here is what that lever looked like in practice. South of Mali, in the regions of Bambouk and Bure, were some of the richest alluvial gold deposits on the planet. Miners worked them with techniques refined over generations, pulling gold from the earth in quantities that would have seemed mythological to anyone who hadn't seen it. But raw gold sitting in the ground is worth nothing without a way to move it, a place to sell it, and a system of security that makes the journey possible. Mali provided all three. The empire controlled the roads. It provided the military protection that made long-distance trade survivable. and it taxed every transaction that moved through its territory with a precision that suggests not greed, but genuine administrative sophistication. Because a dead golden goose produces nothing, and the rulers of Mali understood that keeping merchants willing to come back was worth more than extracting everything from them on a single visit. And then there was the salt. This is the part of the story that most people find hardest to absorb, because we live in a world where salt costs almost nothing and is so available that we barely notice it. In the 14th century, in the interior of West Africa, salt was as valuable as gold by weight. Communities that had no access to salt-producing regions could not preserve food through droughts, could not survive the dry season, could not function as stable societies at all. The great salt mines of Tagaza, deep in the Saharan interior, produced slabs of the stuff that were literally used as building material because there was nothing else available. And those slabs moved south through Mali's trade routes in exchange for the gold moving north. Mali sat at the intersection of these two flows, collecting taxes from both directions, and became, in the process, something that no army could have manufactured: indispensable. Timbuktu. Let that word land properly for a second. In contemporary usage, it has become a synonym for impossibly far away, a shorthand for the edge of the known world, and then some. But in the 14th century, Timbuktu was not a metaphor for remoteness. It was a metropolis. A city at the intersection of three of the most active trade routes in the medieval world, with a population in the tens of thousands. A university, the Sankore Madrasa, that hosted students and scholars from across the Islamic world, and a manuscript market so active that books were among the city's most profitable exports. Scholars in Timbuktu were writing on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law, while most of Europe was still 2 centuries away from its own Renaissance. The city that has become the butt of a joke about distance was, in its prime, one of the most intellectually alive places on the planet. But Timbuktu was not unique within the empire. Djenné, Niani, Kumbi, these were cities with real populations, real economies, real administrative infrastructure. The Mali Empire, at its height, stretched across territory equivalent to roughly the size of Western Europe, encompassing a population that historians estimate somewhere between 40 and 60 million people. It had governors, judges, a standing army, and a postal system that moved information across vast distances with impressive reliability. When the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Mali in the 1340s, roughly 20 years after Musa's hajj, he wrote about it with the barely restrained admiration of a man who had traveled more widely than almost any person alive and was still finding things that surprised him. He noted the security on the roads, the honesty of the markets, the sophistication of the legal system, and the order that pervaded daily life in a way he described as exceptional, even by the standards of the greatest cities he had visited. This was not a primitive kingdom waiting to be discovered. This was a civilization operating at full capacity. So when you imagine the world that Mansa Musa stepped into when he assumed the throne, don't imagine a young man inheriting a pile of gold and a stretch of desert. Imagine a man taking control of the most sophisticated economic machine in the medieval world. A living network of roads, taxes, military alliances, scholarly institutions, and trade relationships that had been built over generations and was running, at the moment he inherited it, better than it had ever run before. The question was never whether Mali was powerful enough. The question, the one that was about to define his entire reign, was what a man with that much power, sitting on that much wealth, at the center of that much history, was going to do next. Because Musa had a vision for his empire that went beyond administration, beyond taxation, beyond even conquest. He wanted the world to know what he had, and he was about to show them in a way that no ruler before or since has ever quite managed to replicate. There is a version of this story where Mansa Musa is simply a man who was in the right place at the right time, a deputy, an administrator, a warm body holding the seat while the real king was away doing something magnificent. And then, the real king never came back. So the deputy became the king, and that was that. If you want the clean, uncomplicated version, that's it. But here is the thing about clean, uncomplicated versions of history. They are almost always wrong. And this one in particular leaves out the most extraordinary detail. The detail that makes the entire succession feel less like a bureaucratic handover and more like something out of a myth. Because the king who never came back didn't disappear into a battle or a plague or a palace conspiracy. He sailed into the Atlantic Ocean with 2,000 ships, looking for the edge of the world. And he never found it. Or, if he did, he never came home to say so. The predecessor's name, as best historians can reconstruct it, was Mansa Muhammad ibn Q. He had ruled the Mali Empire with competence and had inherited a kingdom already operating at the peak of its considerable powers. But somewhere along the way, he developed an obsession that was going to cost him everything. He became convinced that the Atlantic Ocean, that vast, dark expanse off the west coast of Africa that no one from this part of the world had ever successfully crossed, had another shore. That there was something on the other side. The question consumed him the way certain questions consume certain minds, completely, irrevocably, at the expense of all other considerations. He didn't want to send someone else to find out. He wanted to go himself. And so he organized what may be the most ambitious maritime expedition the medieval world had ever attempted, loaded 2,000 ships with enough provisions to sustain a small city for years, placed the most capable administrator he trusted in charge of the empire until he returned, and sailed west into a horizon that had swallowed everyone before him. That administrator was Musa. And we need to sit with the weight of that appointment for a moment, because it tells us something crucial. You do not leave your empire, an empire producing more than half the world's gold, governing tens of millions of people, controlling the most strategically important trade routes on the continent, in the hands of someone you don't trust absolutely. The choice of Musa as deputy wasn't random. It wasn't the result of political maneuvering or dynastic obligation alone. It was a vote of confidence from a man who was about to bet his life on a theory about the ocean, and who needed to know that everything he was leaving behind would still be standing when he returned. Musa was chosen because he was the most capable man available. That is a detail worth carrying forward. The fleet sailed. Weeks passed, then months. One battered vessel eventually limped back to the coast, its captain describing what the others had encountered. A place in the ocean where the current ran like a river in reverse, massive and violent and impossible to fight, and where ships had been swallowed by whirlpools one after another until almost nothing remained of the original expedition. The captain had survived by turning back. Everyone else, the king, his crew, the men and women and supplies on nearly 2,000 ships, had vanished into the water without a trace. When Musa heard this account, he faced a choice that history has recorded but rarely examined properly. He could continue to wait. He could organize a search. He could declare the king lost at sea and proceed with a formal succession that acknowledged the previous bloodline. Instead, and this is where some modern historians raise an eyebrow, he took the throne. The skeptics make a reasonable case. They point out that Musa's version of events, the only version we have, was recorded by an Arab historian named al-Umari, who heard it from Musa himself during a conversation in Cairo during the Hajj. In other words, the primary source for the story of the king who sailed away is the man who benefited most from the king being gone. Some historians have suggested, with carefully measured academic language that translates roughly to, "We think he made this up," that Musa may have orchestrated or accelerated the previous king's disappearance and invented the Atlantic voyage narrative as a politically elegant way to explain a transfer of power that was, in reality, rather less romantic. It is the kind of theory that is impossible to prove and equally impossible to dismiss. And it makes Musa, depending on which version you believe, either a loyal deputy thrust into power by circumstance or a calculating architect who understood that the best way to seize a throne without starting a civil war is to give the previous occupant a heroic exit. What we know for certain is this. Around the year 1312, Mansa Musa became the ruler of the Mali Empire. The line of succession shifted from the descendants of Sundiata Keita, the founder of the empire, to a different branch of the royal family, specifically the descendants of Sundiata's brother. It was not a bloodbath. There are no records of the kind of brutal dynastic purges that accompanied most medieval successions in other parts of the world. The transition was, by the standards of the time, remarkably clean. Whether that cleanness reflects Musa's genuine legitimacy or his political genius is a question the historical record refuses to answer definitively. Both explanations are consistent with everything else we know about him. Because here is what we do know about the man who stepped onto that throne. He was devoutly Muslim in a way that was not merely ceremonial. His faith was going to shape every major decision of his reign, from his relationship with scholars and architects to the single most consequential journey of his life. He was an administrator of genuine talent, demonstrated by the fact that a king trusted him with an entire empire before sailing off into the unknown. And he had been watching, from his position as deputy, how the machine worked, how the gold moved, how the trade routes were managed, how the balance of military power and diplomatic relationship kept the whole structure standing. He had not just inherited a kingdom, he had studied it. And now, with no one standing between him and the full weight of the throne, he was about to show the world what he had learned. Forget everything you think you know about how empires get rich. The standard model, conquest, tribute, slavery, taxation at sword point, describes most of the powerful states in human history with depressing accuracy. You take something from someone weaker than you keep taking until there is nothing left, and then you move on to the next target. It is brute force extraction dressed up in the language of civilization. What Mali built under the kings who preceded Musa, and what Musa himself perfected, was something fundamentally different. It was not an empire that got rich by taking. It was an empire that got rich by being impossible to bypass. And that distinction between taking and being indispensable is the difference between a kingdom that lasts a generation and a system that runs for centuries. Start with the gold. The mines of Bambuk and Bure, located in the western and southern reaches of Mali's territory, were producing a volume of gold that the medieval world had no real framework for understanding. At the peak of the empire's power, Mali was the source of nearly half of all the gold circulating in what historians call the Old World, meaning Africa, Europe, and Asia combined. Not half of West Africa's gold, half of the world's. Every coin minted in the Mediterranean, every transaction settled in gold dust from Morocco to Cairo to the markets of the Middle East was downstream from what those miners were pulling out of the ground in territory that Musa and his predecessors controlled. Portugal's currency was indirectly backed by Malian gold. The economies of North Africa ran on it. And here is the detail that most people miss entirely. Mali's rulers did not directly control the mines themselves. They didn't have to. The system was more elegant than direct control and far more durable. The goldfields were operated by local miners who maintained their independence and, critically, kept the location of the richest deposits a closely guarded secret. Trade happened through a practice that historians have called the silent trade, a system so precise and so deliberately impersonal that it borders on genius. Malian traders would arrive at the edge of the goldfield region, lay out their trade goods, salt, cloth, copper, beat a drum to signal their presence, and then withdraw. The miners would emerge, examine the goods, leave their gold offering beside each item, and retreat. The traders would return, inspect the gold, and either take it if the amount was acceptable or leave it to signal that they wanted more. No direct contact, no negotiation, no possibility of violence disrupting the flow of commerce. It was, in its own way, the most sophisticated supply chain management system in the medieval world. A structure that kept the goldfields secret, protected territorial borders, and preserved a monopoly that no outside power could simply walk in and seize. Then there was the salt. Picture what it actually meant to live in the interior of West Africa in the 14th century without reliable access to salt. Your food spoiled in the heat before you could eat it. Your livestock weakened. The basic biological functions that salt supports in the human body, nerve transmission, fluid balance, muscle function, began to fail. Salt was not a seasoning. It was a survival requirement, and the interior regions of the continent were critically undersupplied. Meanwhile, in the middle of the Sahara, in a place called Tagaza, so remote and inhospitable that the buildings were literally constructed from blocks of salt because there was no other available material, enormous deposits of the substance sat, waiting to be extracted. Mali controlled the routes between those deposits in the communities that needed them. A single block of salt could be worth its equivalent weight in gold by the time it reached the southern markets. Musa's empire collected taxes from every slab that moved through, in both directions, on every journey, every season, year after year. Now combine those two flows, gold moving north, salt moving south, and add to them the taxation of copper, ivory, cola nuts, enslaved people, textiles, and every other commodity that moved through Mali's territory on the trans-Saharan highway. The revenues were, by every historical estimate we have, incomprehensible. Arab historian al-Umari, writing from first-hand accounts gathered during Musa's visit to Cairo, described the annual income of the empire in terms that contemporary readers found difficult to believe were not exaggeration. What the numbers actually represent is a system that had been compounding for nearly a century before Musa inherited it. Not a single lucky discovery, but a machine that produced wealth continuously, automatically, at scale, because it had been designed to make itself indispensable to every party involved. The merchants needed the routes, the miners needed the markets, the salt producers needed the buyers, and Mali sat at the center of every transaction, collecting its percentage every single time. What Musa added to this machine was not additional conquest, though he did expand the empire's territory significantly during his reign, absorbing the trading city of Timbuktu and the strategically vital city of Gao into Mali's direct control. What he added was something more valuable in the long run: legitimacy. Because there is a critical difference between an empire that extracts wealth through fear and an empire that attracts wealth through reputation. Musa understood, with the intuition of someone who had studied the machine before he was allowed to operate it, that the real vulnerability of Mali's system was trust. Merchants had to believe the routes were safe. Scholars had to believe the cities were places worth inhabiting. Diplomats had to believe the ruler was a counterpart worth engaging with. The moment that trust cracked, the whole architecture would begin to come apart. So Musa invested in trust the same way he invested in everything else, at a scale that left no room for doubt. He expanded the judiciary. He strengthened the administrative systems that kept the trade route secure. He invited scholars and architects and poets to his court, and made Timbuktu into a city that people wanted to travel thousands of miles to reach. Which meant those same people spent money in Mali's markets, paid taxes on Mali's roads, and went home talking about what they had seen. What Musa built was something that the wealthiest tech companies of the modern era would recognize immediately: a platform. Not a single product, not a single mine, not a single trade route, but a system of systems in which every participant had a reason to keep the platform running and a strong incentive never to try to destroy it. He was running the medieval world's most sophisticated network effect, and he had been doing it for years before anyone outside West Africa had any idea he existed. That was about to change. There is a detail about Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca that gets mentioned in almost every account, and somehow still doesn't land with the force it deserves. The retinue he assembled for the journey, 60,000 people, including 12,000 servants, each carrying a solid gold staff, 80 camels loaded with gold dust, hundreds of soldiers, musicians, scholars, cooks, physicians, and attendants of every description, was not a display of military power. It was not a diplomatic mission. It was not a trade expedition. It was a man going to pray. That is the scale at which Mansa Musa operated when he was doing something that, by his own standards, was personal and private. When word reached the courts of Europe and the cities of the Middle East that this man was moving through the desert toward the holy city of Mecca, nobody who heard the description initially believed it was accurate. The numbers were too large. The wealth was too visible. It didn't fit any existing category of thing that rulers did. The journey began in 1324, departing from Mali's capital with a column so long that the front of it was arriving at each overnight camp while the back was still breaking down the previous one. They crossed the Sahara, not the gentle, manageable edge of it, but the deep desert, hundreds of miles of sand and heat that killed unprepared travelers with indifferent regularity, and emerged into the Mediterranean world like something out of a fever dream. The cities they passed through had never seen anything like it. Markets that were accustomed to large caravans found themselves unable to supply the expedition's daily requirements. The sheer caloric demand of feeding 60,000 people on the move was a logistics problem that would challenge a modern military. Musa solved it the way he solved most problems, by paying for whatever he needed, instantly and without negotiating, in gold. Cairo was where it became a catastrophe. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Nasir Muhammad, received Musa with the ceremony appropriate for a peer, a ruler of comparable standing, commanding comparable resources. What the Sultan and his court were not prepared for was what happened when Musa moved through their city for the weeks surrounding that meeting. He gave gold to the poor he encountered in the streets, not in the calculated way that powerful people perform generosity for an audience, but apparently with genuine religious conviction as an act of zakat, the Islamic obligation to give to those in need. He paid for goods at prices so far above market rate that merchants began adjusting their expectations upward in real time. He donated to mosques and institutions with a lavishness that local donors couldn't begin to match. And he did all of this without, seemingly, a moment's consideration of what it was doing to the underlying economy of one of the most important cities in the medieval world. The gold supply of Cairo, which had been stable for years, suddenly had an enormous new input. Prices adjusted. Then they crashed. Then the whole system lurched sideways in ways that took more than a decade to correct. And yet, here is the part that makes Musa genuinely fascinating rather than simply overwhelming. He noticed. When his advisors explained what his generosity had done to the Cairo economy, he didn't dismiss the concern or retreat behind the indifference of someone too powerful to care about consequences. He acted. He began borrowing gold back from Cairo's merchants at high interest rates, deliberately contracting the supply he had flooded the market with, in an effort to stabilize the prices he had inadvertently wrecked. The details of how successful this intervention was remain debated. The damage was severe and lasted years regardless. But the instinct itself reveals something important. This was not a man who moved through the world without thinking about what he left behind. The same intelligence that built the platform, that engineered the indispensability, was watching the Cairo markets and recalculating. He was a systems thinker, even when the system in question was one he had just accidentally detonated. From Cairo, the pilgrimage continued east toward the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and here the historical record becomes thinner, but the impact becomes, if anything, larger. Musa completed his hajj with the same overwhelming presence that had characterized the entire journey, and in Mecca and the surrounding cities, his visibility among the scholars and clerics and rulers gathered from across the Islamic world made an impression that would reverberate for generations. He was not merely wealthy. He was visibly, demonstrably, philosophically engaged with his faith. A ruler who had crossed a desert at the head of 60,000 people, not for conquest, not for diplomacy, but for prayer. In a world where religious legitimacy was a form of political currency, at least as valuable as gold, this mattered. It placed him on equal footing with rulers who had previously been able to dismiss sub-Saharan Africa as peripheral to the centers of civilization. After the Hajj of 1324, no informed observer could make that dismissal and be taken seriously. On the return journey, Musa made a decision that is, in some ways, the most consequential of his entire reign. He recruited. Specifically, he recruited a poet and architect from the city of Granada, in what is now southern Spain, named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a man of genuine talent who had been living and working in the intellectual circles of the Islamic Mediterranean world. Musa offered him, by various accounts, a quantity of gold so large that al-Sahili agreed to travel thousands of miles into the interior of a continent he had never visited, to work for a ruler he had just met in cities he had only heard described. What al-Sahili built when he arrived in Mali, and we will get to this in detail, was going to transform Timbuktu from a wealthy trading city into something that the medieval world had seen very few examples of: a genuine intellectual capital. But that comes later. What matters right now is that Musa had spent months moving through the most connected and information-rich environment in the medieval world, watching how the greatest cities functioned, identifying the talent he wanted to bring home, and planning what he was going to build when he got there. The Hajj of 1324 did something that no military campaign, no diplomatic mission, and no trade negotiation could have accomplished. It put Mali on the map. Literally. The famous Catalan Atlas, produced in 1375 by the cartographer Abraham Cresque, contains one of the most striking images in the history of European mapmaking. At the center of Africa, seated on a throne of gold, holding a golden orb and a golden scepter, wearing a golden crown, is a figure identified by name: Mansa Musa. Drawn into the Western imagination 50 years after his Hajj because the memory of what he had done was still so vivid, so impossible to categorize, that the men drawing the world's maps couldn't bring themselves to leave him out. Europe didn't know what Mali was. They didn't fully understand where it was. They certainly didn't teach it in their schools or honor it in their chronicles. But they knew because word had traveled in the way that only truly staggering things travel, that somewhere in the interior of Africa there was a king so rich he had broken an economy by being generous. And they drew his face on their maps of the world. That image is still there. It has always been there. And for 500 years, the people who built our educational systems looked at it and decided, without quite saying so out loud, that it wasn't worth explaining. When Mansa Musa returned from Mecca in 1325, he brought back more than religious fulfillment and a head full of architectural ambitions. He brought back a diagnosis. He had spent months moving through the greatest cities of the medieval Islamic world, Cairo, Medina, Mecca, and he had seen, with the clinical eye of a man who runs a sophisticated empire, exactly what made those cities function at the level they did. It wasn't their markets, though their markets were extraordinary. It wasn't their armies, though their armies were formidable. It was their institutions, their libraries, their universities, their capacity to attract, retain, and deploy the most intelligent people in the world and give those people resources, space, and time to think. Musa came home with a blueprint, and he had brought the architect to execute it. Abu Ishaq al-Sahili arrived in Mali as a poet and left as a legend. What this Andalusian scholar-architect built under Musa's patronage was, by every account we have, genuinely remarkable, not merely by the standards of sub-Saharan Africa, which had been building sophisticated structures for centuries, but by the standards of the medieval world at large. The Jingareber Mosque in Timbuktu, which al-Sahili designed and Musa funded with approximately 200 pounds of gold, was a structure that combined North African architectural traditions with local materials in a way that was both aesthetically distinctive and structurally innovative. It stood. It still stands today, more than 700 years later, functioning as an active mosque in the modern city of Timbuktu. Every time someone walks through its doors, they are walking into a room that Musa paid for because he came home from the pilgrimage and decided that his capital deserved to look like it belonged among the great cities of the world. But the building was the easy part. What Musa was really constructing was an ecosystem. He understood something that patrons of knowledge throughout history have had to learn, often painfully, that you cannot simply build a library and declare victory. Libraries need books. Books need scholars to write them and copy them and argue about them and teach from them. Scholars need students. Students need the reasonable expectation that coming to study in your city will produce better outcomes for them than staying wherever they are. You have to create a gravity, a pull, a reason for the most curious and capable people in the world to choose your city over every other option available to them. Musa created that gravity by the most direct method available. He made Timbuktu one of the wealthiest, most generously funded intellectual environments on the planet. And then he told everyone he had done it. The Sankore Madrasa, the university that grew up around the mosque at the center of Timbuktu, became, under Musa's patronage and in the decades that followed his reign, one of the largest centers of Islamic learning in the world. At its peak, it enrolled somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 students, in a city whose total population historians estimate at around 100,000 people. Think about what that ratio means. Roughly 1 in 4 people living in Timbuktu at the height of its intellectual golden age was a student. The city's manuscript market was so active that books were among its most profitable commodities, and not books in the metaphorical sense of a few handwritten volumes traded between elites, but books as an industry, with professional copyists producing and selling texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, law, and philosophy in numbers that stagger the imagination. When researchers began cataloging the manuscripts that survived in Timbuktu's private family libraries in the late 20th century, they found hundreds of thousands of documents. Some estimates place the total number of manuscripts that once existed in the city's collections at over 1 million. 1 million manuscripts. In a city that the Western world has spent centuries treating as a punchline about remoteness. Let that sit for a moment and do the work it needs to do. Because here is what those manuscripts represent. They represent generations of West African scholars engaging in the same intellectual project that was supposedly the exclusive property of European civilization, asking hard questions about the universe, developing mathematical systems, advancing medical knowledge, debating the principles of governance and justice, writing history with the rigor and detail of people who understood that what happens needs to be remembered and examined and argued about by the people who come after. They were doing this in Timbuktu while the European Renaissance was still a century away. They were doing it in a city that Mansa Musa built, with gold that Mansa Musa spent, according to a vision that Mansa Musa carried home from a pilgrimage that the textbooks, when they mention it at all, describe primarily in terms of its effect on Mediterranean gold prices. And then, over the course of the next several centuries, the deliberate process of making all of this disappear began. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen through a single catastrophic event. It happened the way most historical erasures happen, in layers, each one adding a little more obscurity over what had been there before. The Moroccan invasion of 1691 shattered the political structures of the Western Sudan and sent shockwaves through the scholarly community that Timbuktu had spent generations assembling. Scholars fled. Manuscripts were hidden in the walls of houses, buried under floors, dispersed through family networks across hundreds of miles of desert. Then the transatlantic slave trade restructured the entire moral and intellectual framework through which African history was perceived. Because you cannot industrialize the enslavement of an entire continent without first constructing an ideology that makes it thinkable. And that ideology required, as its foundation, the insistence that the people being enslaved had no history worth knowing, no civilization worth respecting, no intellectual heritage that placed them in the same category as their captors. That insistence was not a spontaneous cultural prejudice. It was a project. It required the active suppression of evidence, the rewriting of histories, the redesign of curricula, and the systematic replacement of accurate information with comfortable myth. It required looking at the Catalan Atlas with Mansa Musa's face drawn in gold at the center of the world, and deciding to build an educational system that treated that image as decorative rather than historical. It required knowing about the Sankore Madrasa and its hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and choosing, generation after generation, to fill the hours of children's education with other things. If the students sitting in classrooms today had been taught the full scope of what Musa built, the universities, the libraries, the trade networks, the architectural legacy, the story that certain people needed those students to believe about the African continent would have been impossible to sell. So they were not taught, and the manuscripts sat in the walls of houses in Timbuktu, waiting for someone to remember they existed. Let's go back to the question that opened this story. Not the economic question, not how one man's generosity detonated a financial catastrophe across the Mediterranean world. The deeper question, the one that's been running underneath everything else since the first minute. Why don't you know his name? You spent years in school. You sat through history classes covering ancient Egypt, classical Greece, the Roman Empire, the medieval European kingdoms, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. You learned the names of kings who ruled territories a fraction of the size of Mali. You memorized the dates of battles whose consequences were smaller than the ripple effects of a single Malian hajj. And somehow, in all of that, the richest human being in recorded history the ruler of an empire larger than Western Europe, the patron of one of the greatest universities the medieval world produced, the man whose face was drawn on the most important map of the 14th century, never quite made it into the curriculum. That is not an accident of emphasis. It is a verdict, and understanding who delivered it and why is the final piece of this story. The colonial project required a specific story about Africa. Not a complicated story, not a nuanced story, but a simple and load-bearing one. That the continent was a place without history, without civilization, without the intellectual and cultural infrastructure that would make its people legible as fully human in the eyes of the system that was exploiting them. This story was not incidental to colonialism. It was the engine that made colonialism morally operable. You cannot enslave tens of millions of people, extract the wealth of an entire continent for 3 centuries, redraw every border according to your own convenience, and then hand the people you've systematically dismantled a fraction of what you took and call it independence, unless you have first convinced yourself and your children and their children that the people you did this to had nothing worth preserving. The erasure of Mansa Musa was not a side effect of that project. It was a prerequisite, and the machinery of that erasure was thorough. It worked through universities that defined what counted as history worth studying. It worked through publishing houses that decided which stories were commercially viable to tell. It worked through the design of school curricula in every country that inherited the European educational model, which is to say, most of the world. It worked through the simple, grinding power of repetition. If a story is never told, the next generation grows up not knowing to ask for it, and the generation after that doesn't even register the absence. By the time you were sitting in that classroom learning about Caesar and Napoleon and the kings of England, the omission of Mansa Musa wasn't a deliberate choice being made in real time. It was just the shape of the room, the water you were swimming in. It didn't feel like suppression because it had long since stopped needing to be active. The silence had become structural. But here is what the silence could not erase. The Jingareber Mosque is still standing in Timbuktu, 700 years old, still functional, still drawing worshippers, still carrying in its mud brick walls the architectural fingerprint of a decision Mansa Musa made because he wanted his capital to be beautiful. The manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of them, survived in the walls of family homes and private collections across the Sahel, passed down through generations of families who understood, without anyone having to explain it to them, that what was written in those pages was worth protecting at considerable personal risk. The Catalan Atlas is still in the collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and if you look at it, really look at it, you will see Mansa Musa's face at the center of the world, drawn there by a Jewish cartographer working in Majorca 50 years after the Hajj, because the story was so large and so verified that even the Europeans who had every reason to minimize it couldn't bring themselves to leave it off the map entirely. The evidence was never destroyed. It was only decided that it didn't count. Now let me close the loop I opened at the beginning. I told you there was a reason they kept him out of your school books, and I want to be precise about what that reason is, because the imprecise version, the version that says it was simply racism, simply ignorance, simply the myopia of people who only valued their own story, is true but incomplete. The complete version is this. The story of Mansa Musa is dangerous to a very specific set of ideas. It is dangerous to the idea that civilization flows in one direction, from Europe outward, from west to the rest. It is dangerous to the idea that wealth accumulation at scale is a uniquely modern, uniquely Western achievement. It is dangerous to the idea that the intellectual traditions worth inheriting are the ones that trace their lineage through Athens and Rome and the European Renaissance. The moment you genuinely absorb what Mali was, what Timbuktu was, what the Sankore Madrasa was, what the manuscripts represent, those ideas do not bend. They break. And the people who built the educational systems that shaped the modern world had invested too much in those ideas to let a West African king with a gold staff dismantle them in a classroom. If you enjoy stories like this one, the ones that don't show up in the textbooks, the ones that require digging past the official version to find what was actually happening, consider subscribing, because this channel exists for exactly this reason, to find the histories that were deliberately set aside and put them back in front of people who deserve to know them. What's coming next goes even deeper into the machinery of historical erasure, and I promise you, it is at least as consequential as what you just heard. But I want to leave you with something that I keep coming back to, because I think it matters more than any individual fact in this entire story. The Timbuktu Manuscripts Project, the effort to digitize and preserve the surviving documents from Mali's golden age, is ongoing right now. Scholars are still cataloging what was hidden in those walls. New texts are still being identified, translated, studied. The history that was buried is actively being unburied by researchers who understood that the silence was a crime and decided to answer it with work. And what they are finding, document by document, is exactly what the people who built the silence were afraid of finding. Evidence that the full range of human intellectual achievement was never the property of any single civilization. That curiosity, rigor, beauty, and the hunger to understand the world are not cultural inheritances. They are human ones. Mansa Musa built a city that proved it. The proof survived. And now you know it existed. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.